40 years ago, October 20th at 6:30, is about the time that we went down.
For nearly 5 decades, the name Lynyrd Skynyrd has carried with it a weight that no amount of rock and roll glory can fully explain. Mention it to anyone who was alive in October of 1977, and you won't just get a musical reference. You'll get a pause, a look, something behind the eyes that mixes pride and grief in equal measure. The band didn't just die in a plane crash. They disappeared from the world mid-sentence, right in the middle of what was shaping up to be the greatest chapter of their career. And for years, the story of what really happened on that Mississippi night has been clouded by myth, mourning, and the kind of selective memory that tends to surround rock and roll tragedy. But here is what the mythology gets wrong. This was not a mystery. It was never truly unsolvable. The truth, once you sit with every documented detail, every testimony, every page of the official investigation, is not dramatic in the way legends prefer. It is worse than that. It is mundane. It is the kind of truth that doesn't arrive with thunder. It arrives quietly, with paperwork, and it says the same thing over and over until you can't unhear it. This didn't have to happen. And the reason it happened is not fate, not cosmic punishment for living fast, not some supernatural toll extracted from men who played too hard and loved too recklessly. The reason is simpler and uglier than any of that. Today, we are solving the Lynyrd Skynyrd mystery. All of it. The plane, the warnings, the decisions, and the one factor that almost every popular account buries in a footnote. By the end of this, you will understand not just what went wrong, but how clearly everyone involved could see it coming, and chose to look away. To understand the weight of what was lost, you first have to understand where Lynyrd Skynyrd stood in October of 1977. This was not a band coasting on past reputation. This was a band accelerating. They had spent the early part of the decade clawing their way out of Jacksonville, Florida, with a sound that had no real category. Too rough for country radio, too southern for mainstream rock, too melodic for hard rock purists. They filled the gap themselves and called it something that didn't need a name, because when you heard it, you knew exactly what it was. By the mid-70s, they had built one of the most devoted live followings in American music. Their concerts were legendary not for spectacle but for intensity. Ronnie Van Zant commanded a stage with the kind of authority that can't be taught or manufactured. He stood at the center of something real, and every person in every arena felt it. The guitar interplay between Gary Rossington, Alan Collins, and the newer addition Steve Gaines had become something genuinely extraordinary. 3 distinct personalities creating a sound that was larger than the sum of its parts. Their new album, Street Survivors, had just been released on October 17, 1977. 3 days before the crash. The timing of that detail alone is enough to make you stop breathing for a moment. The record was excellent by any measure, and early sales reflected a band breaking through to a new level of commercial reach without sacrificing the raw energy their core audience loved. Steve Gaines, in particular, was attracting attention as one of the most exciting young guitarists in rock music. Critics were paying attention. Radio was responding. The machinery of mainstream stardom was finally aligning in their favor. And then they boarded a plane. The Convair 240 that Lynyrd Skynyrd chartered for the 1977 leg of their tour was not simply old. Many old aircraft are perfectly safe when properly maintained. This particular plane was something more specific than old. It was neglected, poorly documented, and operating with a mechanical history that should have raised serious alarms at every stage of the chartering process. Built in 1948, the airframe had accumulated an enormous number of flight hours. The model itself had been largely phased out of commercial passenger service by major airlines during the late 1960s, replaced by more modern turboprop and jet aircraft. By 1977, a Convair 240 appearing in a charter context was already an unusual choice. But the specific aircraft selected for this tour had additional problems that went beyond age. What is documented and confirmed is that the plane had a troubled maintenance record. It had changed ownership multiple times and been operated in contexts far removed from the regulated oversight of scheduled commercial aviation. The Wright engine, in particular, had shown signs of irregular fuel consumption, a problem that was observable, recordable, and ultimately ignored in ways that would prove catastrophic. The detail that sharpens this into something almost unbearable is the Aerosmith connection. In the months before the Skynyrd tour, Aerosmith's management actively considered chartering this same aircraft. They inspected it. What they found was serious enough to walk away immediately. According to accounts from people close to that decision, the inspection revealed not just mechanical concerns but behavioral ones. The flight crew's conduct during the evaluation raised immediate red flags. Aerosmith's people declined the charter and, according to reports that circulated in industry circles at the time, communicated their concerns to others in the touring music world. The question that has never been fully answered is this: did that warning reach Lynyrd Skynyrd's management, and if so, what did they do with it? The evidence available suggests the warning existed. Whether it was received, understood, taken seriously, or deliberately set aside is where the record becomes frustratingly incomplete. What we know for certain is that Lynyrd Skynyrd boarded a plane that a comparable band had refused to board specifically because it was deemed unsafe. The tragedy of October 20, 1977, is not simply that warning signs existed before the tour began. It is that warning signs continued to pile up during the tour itself, and the response to each one was essentially the same: keep going. On an earlier flight, passengers reported seeing sparks coming from the right engine. This is not a subtle malfunction. Sparks from an aircraft engine in flight are a visible, undeniable, genuinely alarming event. Several people on board were disturbed by what they saw. Among them was Cassie Gaines, one of the backup singers known as the Honkettes and the sister of guitarist Steve Gaines. Her fear was not abstract. She had seen something specific with her own eyes, and it had shaken her badly enough that she reportedly considered not boarding the plane again. She spoke about riding in the equipment truck instead, a choice that, had she made it, would have saved her life. The fact that she was eventually persuaded to board again is one of the most devastating small details in the whole story. It speaks to the culture of the road, the momentum of a working tour, the difficulty of stopping something that has been set in motion. Ronnie Van Zant himself, according to accounts from those present, reassured her. His words to her, that if it was her time, it was her time, have become part of the mythology. But strip the mythology away, and what you have is a man using fatalism to override a woman's legitimate safety concern. She was right to be afraid. And she was told not to be. Discussions did take place about switching aircraft. The band's inner circle was apparently aware that the Convair 240 was unreliable. The idea of replacing it with a Learjet for the remainder of the tour was raised and taken seriously enough to be remembered by multiple people after the crash. But the logistics of changing aircraft mid-tour, the scheduling pressures of confirmed dates, and perhaps an underestimation of just how dangerous the situation actually was all combined to delay that decision past the point where it could matter. The plane that took off from Greenville, South Carolina, on the evening of October 20th was a plane that the people on board already had reason to distrust. That is the context in which everything that followed must be understood. When the National Transportation Safety Board completed its investigation into the crash, the findings were not what most people expected. There was no structural catastrophe, no explosive mechanical failure, no freak weather event or sudden technical emergency that no amount of preparation could have foreseen. The plane ran out of fuel. That is the answer. That is the mystery solved. Not with a revelation, but with something far more deflating, a basic, preventable failure of operational procedure that had nothing to do with fate and everything to do with human error inside the cockpit. The investigation determined that the flight crew was operating the engines in what is known as the auto-rich fuel mixture setting. This is a configuration used during takeoff and initial climb because it provides maximum power during the most demanding phase of flight. Once an aircraft reaches cruising altitude, standard procedure requires switching to the auto-lean setting, which consumes significantly less fuel. The crew of the Convair 240 on October 20th, 1977, never made that switch. They flew the entire route burning fuel at the takeoff rate. This error alone would have been serious. Combined with inadequate fuel monitoring, it became fatal. The crew apparently misjudged how much fuel they had remaining and failed to detect the right engine's known tendency toward higher than normal consumption. By the time the right engine failed, they were already in a situation with almost no margin for error. What happened next made it worse. In attempting to address the fuel imbalance between tanks, the crew accidentally vented the remaining fuel overboard. The technical details of that moment are almost too painful to examine closely. The people in that cockpit were trying to fix a problem and in doing so eliminated the last slim possibility of recovery. Both engines quit. The aircraft began descending over dense, swampy Mississippi woodland with no power and no realistic path to a safe landing. They attempted to divert to an airfield in Mississippi. They didn't have enough fuel to make it. The moment when the passengers understood what was happening has been described by survivors in ways that are remarkably consistent. There was no panic. That detail tends to surprise people, but it is confirmed repeatedly across different accounts. When drummer Artemis Pyle visited the cockpit and was told urgently to return to his seat and buckle in, the atmosphere on board shifted. Word moved through the cabin. People grasped the situation. And then, according to those who lived through it, a strange quiet descended. Ronnie Van Zant, who had been sleeping on the floor with a pillow, reportedly exhausted from performing the night before, was awake and aware in those final minutes. Billy Powell later described the atmosphere as a collective act of prayer. People held each other. Some closed their eyes. Nobody screamed. The aircraft dropped lower, the cabin lights flickering, the trees outside the windows growing larger and more specific. The impact, when it came, was described by Gary Rossington as sounding like thousands of baseball bats striking the fuselage simultaneously. The plane tore through approximately 1,000 feet of forest, disintegrating as it went. The cockpit separated from the fuselage and struck a tree directly, killing both pilots instantly. The wings were destroyed. The tail section came apart. Those seated in the rear of the aircraft had a marginally better chance of survival simply because of where the structural forces concentrated. Ronnie Van Zant died in the crash. Steve Gaines died. Cassie Gaines, the woman who had been afraid to board, who had seen the sparks, who had almost chosen the truck, died. Assistant road manager Dean Kilpatrick also perished. The pilots were gone. Those who survived did so with devastating injuries. Gary Rossington, one of the founding members, suffered 2 broken arms, a shattered leg, damage to his internal organs, and multiple broken ribs. Leon Wilkeson was declared dead 3 times at the scene before being stabilized. Billy Powell's facial injuries were severe. The wreckage was scattered across swampy woodland in the dark, and the nearest help was miles away. Of all the individual stories that emerged from the crash site, the one involving Artemis Pyle stands apart for its sheer physical and emotional extremity. Pyle had survived the impact with broken ribs, injuries that would have incapacitated most people entirely. Instead, he did what no one else on that forest floor was in a condition to do. He got up and started walking. The terrain was brutal, dense underbrush, swampy ground, near total darkness, and stretches of barbed wire that tore into him as he pushed through. He was bleeding. He was in serious pain with every breath. He had no idea how far he would need to walk or whether he would find anything at the end of it. He kept going anyway. When he finally reached a farmhouse, the homeowner, a man named Johnny Moat, responded to the sight of a bleeding, disheveled stranger emerging from the woods at night in the only way that made sense to him. He fired a warning shot. When Pyle kept coming, Moat shot him in the shoulder. It was only when Pyle managed to communicate that there had been a plane crash that Moat understood what was in front of him. He brought Pyle inside, called for emergency services, and the rescue operation that would pull survivors from the wreckage began. That walk through the dark, injured, bleeding, shot at, is one of the most remarkable acts of determination in the history of rock and roll. And it is barely remembered outside of dedicated Skynyrd fan communities, while the mythology around the crash grows larger every year. The crash did not end on October 20th, 1977. For the people who lived through it, it simply changed form. The physical injuries were severe and lasting. Gary Rossington underwent surgeries for decades and lived with chronic pain and serious heart problems until his death in 2023, the last of the original founding members to go. Leon Wilkeson came back to play bass with the reformed band but never fully recovered his health and died in 2001. Alan Collins, who co-wrote much of the band's most beloved music, was paralyzed from the waist down in a car accident in 1986 and died from pneumonia in 1990. The psychological toll is harder to document but no less real. Survivors spoke in interviews across the years about guilt, grief, and the strange experience of continuing to perform music that was inseparable from people who were no longer alive. The reformed Skynyrd that emerged in the late 1980s, centered around Johnny Van Zant, Ronnie's brother, was always, in some sense, a tribute act to its own past. The weight of that history made it both